art nerds. So we are just about finished with the student grade showdown, and that means I can start reviewing professional grade watercolors for you guys again. And I'm really excited about that because, man, I might have some trauma from the student grade showdown, and it would just be nice to get to work with some professional grade watercolors once again. So we're gonna hit it off with a good one. Today we are taking a look at Mijello's Mission Gold half pans. Now, if you've watched this channel for a while, you'll know that I reviewed Mijello a while back and I really like them. And I have set up Mijello tube watercolors in half pans. So I want to see how their half pans compare against my prior experiences with Mijello, and if this little travel size 24 color set might be a good fit for you or a good fit for somebody who is looking to get started with professional grade watercolor. So I am really excited to be able to share this with you guys today, and I hope you guys are looking forward to it too. Hey there, art nerds! I am finally just about done reviewing all the watercolors that I'm going to review for the student grade showdown. So that means we can return to professional grade watercolors. Watercolors that we should hopefully enjoy and be able to make use of. And even if they aren't for me specifically, you guys might enjoy them. And today, I think we're really going to knock it out of the park because I have reviewed their tube watercolors before years and years and years ago. So old fans of the channel maybe know what I'm talking about. I guess you know what I'm talking about because you read the title. But we are taking a look at Mijello's Gold Class Mission Gold Class watercolor pans. And I have been holding on to this forever. I saw it on Amazon, and since I like Mission Gold watercolors and I have the little 5 milliliter tubes and many of them have run out, I thought this might be a wonderful way to try something new, share it with you guys, and get to have some more Mission Gold colors because unfortunately for me, they are not so easy to find open stock here in Southeast Louisiana. So I am super excited to unbox and swatch this with you guys today. And I also wanted to mention that I have some I have restocked my art prints, like these adorable designs here. We have the little artists and we have the Ponchatoula strawberries. They have all been uniquely signed in Posca markers, so they should be fairly archival. And they were printed by Cat Print on their cotton felt paper, and I think they are absolutely gorgeous. I am so excited about them. They are in the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. I am also working on some new print designs, a bunch of them. I got the proofs in. You guys might have seen that in the shorts a while back. I need to do some color correcting, but once I have the final versions in stock and signed, those will be in the Natto shop as well. So if you like my art and you'd like an affordable way to own some of it, I do have art prints and I am going to work on listing originals as well. So keep an eye out for that. But let us unbox and swatch the Mijello Mission Gold half pan watercolors. So for my completionist friends here, this is the listing on Amazon. As you guys can see, it has been sitting in my house for almost a year now, so it is time beyond time to talk about it. I wanted to kind of wrap up the student grade showdown before I treated myself to some professional grade watercolors. I ordered the 24 color set, but it is also available in a cute compact little 12 color set, as well as the beautiful but kind of big 48 color set. And these are half pans of watercolor, and it is, as you guys can see, a plastic palette. And here we are back at the desktop. It came in this little cardboard box. It has the Amazon sticker on the back. It promises a new watercolor palette with 3 innovative features, an inner case that securely holds the pans, which contain solid watercolor paint, The paint mixing plates secured with steel pins can be comfortably used by either left or right-handed people. The body case with a sturdy fastener that protects the contents. New pans make it possible for artists like you to enjoy the same quality of colorfulness, brightness, and saturation as the Mission Gold tube. And these are made in Korea. And you can learn more at mijello.com. And then inside is our plastic watercolor palette, and it has been shrink wrapped. Kind of impressed already. We have this rotating mixing surface that has a bit of a matte finish, so hopefully it will be easier to mix colors. As you guys can see, it removes, and it actually uses a metal pin to hold it in place, and regardless of what orientation you have it in, it swings back into place. We also have this to protect the watercolors themselves, as well as a swatch sheet. Oh, very nice. With all of the color information on it. I appreciate not having to dig. And then, I'm trying not to break this. It does not want to come out. Oh, what did I do wrong? There, okay, or that. This seems like it is. I did read the instructions, but can you tell I don't remember the instructions? I do not remember how these are held into place. I did have a little trouble getting this open, and there isn't any. Oh, hey, this was done on Baohong watercolor paper. We have talked about that here on the channel before. I know you can lift this out, so I may have to tinker with it a bit more to be able to remove this. So I was able to pull the black plastic grid that holds our pans in place out completely, and it kind of looks like this. Kind of cartridge style. Theoretically, you could buy empties of these and just pop them into place. Their palette has been spray painted white, kind of like their Stay Wet palettes, and it has this slightly matte finish that bodes pretty well for being able to mix colors on the plastic surface rather than it beading up. The exterior has I would almost say there's like a slight hint of metallic to it, but I might be wrong. Very, very classy looking. And these look like they were poured watercolors. So I believe I said there was no other paperwork with this. I actually found this in the box. I don't know why it didn't shake out when I opened it. So Colors by Nature, Mijello. Inside, they talk a little bit about their manufacturing process, which is kind of neat to see. I wonder if we went to their website, if we would see this in action. They also explain the filling process, how I believe, unfortunately I cannot read Korean, that with these kind of hand-poured watercolors, you'll get this kind of dip like we're seeing here. Whereas with extruded watercolors, we're going to get kind of this bowed over effect, which I've seen with Winsor & Newton numerous times. It also shows some of the features of the palette itself, as well as how to open it and change around your half pans. So pretty neat. I would say though, this is probably intended for the Korean market rather than the US market, because the paperwork is in Korean, but Mission Gold watercolors are sold in the US by some major retailers. So if this isn't available for the US market, I'm sure it will be at some point in the future. So I am going to run today's professional watercolor review pretty similarly to how I run my student grade showdown reviews, we are going to swatch on their swatch sheet. We're going to swatch on Blick cottonrag paper. We're going to look at opacity. We're going to look for optical brighteners. We're going to look at how much they muddy the water. We're going to do a lift test to see how liftable these are. We want to see a variety of liftabilities, kind of depending on the colors and the pigment choices. We're going to do some color mixing, and we'll probably do a wet into wet test. Depending on what we see and how I feel, I will either do a big full field test in another follow-up video, or I will do a bookmark with you guys. I haven't decided yet, and just because I do the bookmark doesn't mean I'm not going to do the field test. Again, it really kind of just depends on how much these watercolors inspire me and what kind of vibes I'm picking up from it. So after spritzing it, I did notice that some of the colors have lightened up a little bit, but I wouldn't say all of the colors have lightened up. And generally my experiences with Mijello is they are very saturated, very finely milled watercolors. So while we might see some granulation with some colors like ultramarine blue, we're probably not going to see as much granulation as we would with, say, Sennelier or M. Grams or Daniel Smith. So if you are interested in maybe doing watercolor comics where you're painting maybe a lot of little tiny faces, these might be a better fit than something with more granulation to it that might make the tiny little faces start to look kind of muddy. I went ahead and spritzed these to pre-activate them, and some colors lightened up quite a bit, which is, as we've talked about in the student grade showdown, not a good sign. It's kind of challenging for me to get my small flat into the wells with this grid system, so this might not be a great fit for artists who like to paint larger. And that said, Mijello makes the Stay Wet palettes that are much better for larger brushes, so it's all about finding what works for you. For this swatch test, I'm going to do 2-layer swatches. I'm doing a washout, which you guys see me doing right here, where we're using a little bit of clean water to encourage it to blend out, see how the pigments move and to encourage granulation. And then once that dries, I'm going to go over it halfway through with a masstone. I'm sorry my swatches are kind of messy. I have to paint at an angle to get everything on camera. For the first layers, while many colors do rush to fill the swatch, it's not a universal, and most present a gradient of color, unlike many of the dye-based student grade watercolors that I've reviewed. This feels like a very compact set for a 24 half pan set, and I mean that in a positive way. For the most part, the masstone swatches are very saturated. This set honestly might not need a whole lot of pre-activation, considering that these were poured and not extruded paints. I am so sorry about how messy my swatches are. It's hard to get a good angle, and be on camera. So they're not as pretty as one might hope. I also had to kind of swap things around to get it to actually correspond to what the palette says. But I do like the included swatch card. I like that it's 100% cotton rag. I like that they include most of the information. They include, there's not anything I'm missing. You have the series, you have the number, you have the name, you have the pigment, you have the light fastness, you have the transparency, and then I think the little triangle denotes how staining or how granulating they are. I mean, you can't really ask for much more out of a little swatch sheet like this. Maybe if they'd pre-printed a little opacity line. I drew mine up there just to see how opaque that white's going to be. Y'all probably know by now, I am not a fan of white in watercolor. I mean, I use white gouache. I'm just not a fan of including a white pan in the palette. Honestly, in my opinion, I think a Payne's Gray would have just been a nicer fit than a white, but All right, so next we are going to do our swatching on the Blick cotton rag watercolor paper. I don't foresee it being much different from what we saw here. I'll just have a little bit more room to expand. Switching over to the Blick cotton rag paper, I noticed that I had trouble doing gradiated swatches on this paper. The colors are also not as saturated as I had hoped. I've used Mijello in the past, so I want to be lenient, but this might require a field test. And spoiler, I did actually do a field test with these paints. So as you guys could tell, this is a 2-in-1 review where it's both an unboxing swatch and a field test, because these paints left a lot of questions in my mind. And rather than leaving you guys hanging, I decided to just go ahead and field test it. So we have our masstone swatch, and then we have a smaller gradiated swatch. And I tried to do them a little bit wider than I normally do, just so that we have plenty of room to see how the paints handle and how the paints react. I don't know why, but these are taking forever to dry. I'm also kind of disappointed by how desaturated some of them are and how the colors are just flooding the area. I know Mijello is a quality professional grade watercolor. I love the two watercolors, have been using them for years, so I really want to give them the benefit of the doubt and not make too many snap or harsh judgments at this point. We can see a little bit of granulation, and the neutrals do feel like better neutrals than what I've seen from a lot of the student grade watercolors. So I'm not writing it off just yet, but this might have to be one for the field test. So next, I want to put these little mixing palettes to use and do some color mixing over to the side. It's really easy to mix nice secondary mixes, and the plastic surface has been treated in such a way that the colors can actually mix and don't just immediately beat up and then refuse to mix. So great job, Mijello. I have reviewed so many plastic palettes that it's really a struggle to get the colors to just mix on the mixing surface. This is a travel palette that actually allows for mixing. Now, I wouldn't say the mixes are any less saturated than the original watercolor swatches, but both are a little bit underwhelming, and I found that to be kind of confusing given it's Mijello and pretty disappointing. I found it pretty easy to mix nice secondary mixes, and the plastic surface has been treated in such a way that the colors actually can mix and don't just immediately beat up and refuse to mix. So great job, Mijello. A travel palette that actually allows for mixing. Now, I wouldn't say these mixes are any less saturated than the original swatches, but both are a little bit underwhelming. So now that these have had a chance to dry, I think it's time for the lift test. The lift test revealed a decent mix of lifting and staining colors. The ones you'd think would lift do lift for the most part, and the ones you think would stain. I couldn't try the green gold though because it was still wet. And since we have a little bit of space down here at the bottom, I figure I'll do the wet into wet test down here. Now, the wet into wet test came about during the student grade showdown, and it's just kind of a chance to see how watercolors handle in a wet into wet application, how they diffuse, how they mix with other colors, if there's optical brighteners, if there's haloing, anything like that. The wet into wet test is a great way to kind of suss that out and to see how good the watercolors will be in a field test situation where I'm actually painting an illustration using the methods that I normally use for watercolor. So I figured I like it so much for the student grade showdown, and it's really helped me learn a lot about watercolors. I figured I would bring that into my professional watercolor reviews as well. Now for our little mini wet into wet test. Colors diffuse really readily and very prettily and intermix readily in water. They're capable of soft, misty mixes, and I'm not seeing any optical brightener halos or weird stodginess to the paint. Now, as it dries, the colors don't seem to fade significantly, but I still felt like something was amiss, and I felt like we needed a field test before I could do the pros and cons or the verdict. In this little hyperlapse, you can see the colors start to lighten up just a little bit as it dries. That is just pretty typical for watercolors in general. So with the wet to wet test, the colors diffused really readily and very prettily, and they intermix readily in water. They're capable of soft, misty mixes, and I'm not really seeing any optical brightener halos. This is where the water had pooled and it kind of bloomed up, so we're not really talking about that. We're talking about this main body here. I also didn't experience any weird like stodginess or stiffness to the paint like I've seen with some of the other brands that I've reviewed. Not professional grade brands, but you know, some of the other brands that I've reviewed. And as it dried, the colors didn't really seem to desaturate significantly. So now I have to admit I am at a bit of a dilemma. They didn't swatch as saturated as I was hoping or expected them to, but they performed quite well in other ways. So I think the best way for me to decide whether these paints are paints that I can recommend to you guys is to do a field test. I'm also kind of biased because I have previous experience with Mijello's tube paints and really like those. In fact, I may be tempted to go, I let them dry in half pans. It might be kind of tempting to go out and re-swatch them. I'll have to think about that and we can do a comparative swatch. But I think for me to be able to give you guys my true pros and cons, I'm going to have to do a field test. The illustration that I'm using for the field test is from last year's Lilliputian Living, which was pet themed. It is up on my Instagram. Just check the hashtag Lilliputian Living. If you think this is cute, I have the first volume of the first 4 years of Lilliputian Living available in my shop. So I'm having issues with the Stonehenge releasing all the dye from my prints. So I'm using Canson Moulin de Roy, another paper that I love. This paper had no issue releasing all the dye. I'm not entirely sure about what color palette I want to use for this, so I decided to go with the known colors first. The wildflowers, referencing Louisiana wildflowers for the most part, minus the lavender. Painting the wildflowers, the colors feel kind of muted compared to what I'm used to from Mijello. I feel like I can't get the saturated I want from some of the colors, or when I do, they start to go to mud. I wanted the colors to stay late summer, vibrant, and fresh, so I did very limited color mixing, mainly 2 color mixes to get blue violets or cerulean blues, but I still feel like the blues are a little underwhelming. These also do get gummy and will gum up on your brush, so utilizing a palette of some sort is helpful, and while their palette is an improvement over many plastic palettes, I can already see staining on the white surface. I'm using their palettes for the wildflowers just to give it a good run for its money, but I'll probably switch to ceramic palettes for the girls and the mouse. I'm sort of having difficulty finding things to say about this palette so far because I'm kind of underwhelmed. If these were student grade, I'd be pretty happy. They sort of remind me of the Melian pigments in saturation and in how they handle. They're a little gummier than I'm used to for tube paints dried in pans, which is what I normally paint with in my daily driver palette. I don't really feel like they're handling like professional paints, although it's hard for me to say that because I genuinely like Mijello and have several Mijello paints in my daily driver palette. I think it might be a change in formulation that slightly changes how they handle, and that's bothering me. Now, all this said, we got a fair amount of rain the evening that I painted the first half of this illustration, so the humidity is high outside, although my hydrometer inside says it's at 32%. So I'm noticing some colors are taking a while to dry, or colors are flooding wet into wet mixes more than I might expect. I feel like I'm really struggling to build up I feel like I'm really struggling to build up saturation for some colors like the Quin Magenta and the Quin Crimson Lake. And no matter how much I seem to layer it on, it seems to dry less saturated than I'd like. I know regular Mijello have a honey binder, or at least they've claimed to have a honey binder in the past. I wonder if the same is true for these. I actually did try to go digging, and all I could really find was complaints on Wet Canvas about people who feel like Mijello paints are overhyped and they don't like them, so that wasn't very helpful. After painting the flowers, I gave them a spritz to see if the colors will move and if I can get some fun action going. Just a little movement would be fun, and it would add some liveliness. These move some, not too much. They're easy to control, good to get it to loosen up, and some colors will move more than others. You need to give these paints a chance to dry out during paint sessions because they get very goopy and really glob up on the brush, and this causes a lot of paint waste. I shared a WIP, a whip photo of this, and people were commenting that this palette is what they're looking for and that they want this kind of color saturation. I want to point out, this is actually a less saturated professional grade experience than I'm used to. Saturation generally comes from how you handle the paints. So the level of saturation here, this is due to how I like to paint and what I'm looking for in watercolor and what I typically buy for and how I have learned how to use watercolors. This isn't really the palette, this is my style of painting specifically. You should be able to get this level of saturation from almost any professional grade set of paints. If you're interested in more saturated watercolors, I recommend going for professional grade brands. Japanese watercolors such as Holbein, Turner, and Kusakabe tend to be more finely milled and they have less granulation. Shinhan, PWC, and Mijello are typically very finely milled with some granulation and generally have good color saturation. Sennelier, Winsor, Newton, and Da Vinci tend to be easy to use, last a long time, and feature good saturation. Core has some of the best saturation and intensity I've seen for most of their color range, and some may find them challenging to use because Core paints are so saturated. I'm having difficulty getting the girls' skin tones dark enough and building up new layers of skin because these are so finely milled that when they mix and they're watered down, they don't carry much chroma. So it's taking a lot of work to get their skin tone to what I want it to be, especially because I have to mix colors to do it. There isn't anything immediately in the palette that really suits what I'm going for. And as I continued working, I really realized that I couldn't get their skin tones dark enough for the contrast to work, even using my normal evaporative methods or mixing the paint more saturated. Even cheating and mixing in a bit of black, which I really don't like doing for skin tones, really didn't do much. And I found that really frustrating and disappointing because I really wanted to like this palette. I really like Mijello watercolors in the past. I have recommended them in the past. So my inability to paint darker skin tones here is really frustrating, especially because I used Shinhan PWC. This is another another Korean watercolor brand to do a field test where I painted darker skinned people as well, and those handled really well. And I didn't even have the size of a color palette that I have here because I was working with individual tubes, and B, it just mixed so much easier and I could build up the saturation and the color depth and the intensity that I was looking for. So if I were to recommend one Korean watercolor brand over another, I would recommend Shinhan PWC over Mijello, because not only do I feel like they handle a little bit better, but I can get them very cheaply at my local brick and mortar store. And those are the watercolors that I like to use when I'm teaching watercolor classes, whether it's to kids or to adults, because I can more easily afford professional grade watercolors to use for my classes. So since I struggled so much to paint this illustration, I was really disappointed with it, and it really kind of colored how I view it. But I've had a couple weeks to just kind of step away from it, and I really love how it turned out. I think it is super cute. If you'd like to see me offer this as an art print, let me know, and check the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. I'll let you guys know when I have this and other new art prints listed. Even though I switched away from my normal Stonehenge for this field test, I was using a paper I know and love, Canson Moulin de Roy. So the problems I had were really with the paints, not with the paper. Cleaning the plastic palette, I really noticed a fair amount of staining on the white. That doesn't really bother me, but I know it will probably bother some other painters, especially since this was the first real time we used these paints and the staining was pretty prevalent. So as you guys can see, there's definitely some staining on the plastic of this palette. I have kind of mixed feelings about that. Even an enamel coated metal will sometimes stain, especially with the phthalos. So I don't expect it to stay pristine forever. It did stain, I feel like, kind of quickly, and it seems like we've got some purples and we've got some blue greens and we've got some pinks and some yellows and some darker blues. So it seems like a lot of these pigments are actually staining this palette. You could probably clean this out using a melamine sponge if you really wanted to. Obviously, it doesn't bother me enough that I feel like I need to do that, but I did think I would point it out to you guys since this is an entirely plastic palette, and I know that's something that people do care about. I have wrapped up the field test for these Mijello Mission Gold half pans. And now I can finally talk about my thoughts on these paints. So let's start with the pros and cons. The pros are that this is a compact palette size that seems like it would travel well. On that note, it has large unwelled palettes, so there's no divisions to break them up, that allow for plenty of mixing space. The grid system holds the half pans firmly in place, so there's no chance of them breaking loose in your backpack, which, let's be real, some of those little metal tins, those will pop open and there's a good chance your half pans are going to end up all over whatever you're using to take with you. So I can see this as being kind of an improvement on that system. So what are the cons? The colors themselves seem to get used up pretty quickly. They turn soupy and glop up on the brush during long painting sessions. And we saw that here. And that's a multi-part problem. It makes it harder to get exactly the amount of paint you want. It also means you waste a lot of paint. These handle like student grade paints. I kept getting Mei Liang Pigments vibes, but they cost much more. I also could not get the saturation, the color depth, the layering I wanted out of these. There is just not a lot of room for nuance when it comes to color mixing, particularly with their skin tones. I wasn't necessarily aiming to go a whole lot darker than them, but I did here, but to be able to add some more shadows and to better develop the forms of their features would have been great. And I feel like these paints were not doing it. It didn't matter how much saturation, how much I allowed them to evaporate, or how much I layered them. It hit a point where it just wasn't going to go any further. So what is my verdict for the Mijello Mission Gold half pans? These are kind of disappointing for a professional set. I just can't get the value contrast I want. So everything stays at kind of a mid-tone. Whether I try to mix a darker color or just increase the saturation, it just doesn't really work. I tried to lean into this palette's strengths and I still feel like it fell kind of short. These are just kind of disappointing. I just can't get the kind of saturation I need with these, and if I mix things too thick, they're very easy to reactivate, which is not necessarily what I want. It makes me wonder if I misjudged the Mijello watercolors the first time. I painted this on Canson Moulin de Roy, and it was a dream to paint on. It was from an older order, and I think they've changed their paper manufacturing process a bit, but I can tell y'all it's not the paper, it's the paint this time. So this was a weird one because I've had good prior experiences with Mijello Mission Gold watercolors in the past, but I felt like this little mini palette just wasn't quite developing what I was looking for. And usually I would break my unbox and swatch and my Fieldtest. See, they're not quite as saturated as I would expect from Korean watercolors, like I've seen with Mijello Mission Gold in the past, and like I've seen with Shinhan's PWC watercolors, which I continue to use for my classes. They just weren't really delivering what I expected. So rather than break up the Fieldtest into another video, I decided to just go ahead, bite the bullet, and do the Fieldtest in one video. So hopefully you stuck with me. Hopefully you are here at the very end so we can talk about the verdict. So while I was painting this Fieldtest, you guys could see I was getting very frustrated with the colors, with the paint, with my ability to mix. I selected an illustration from my coloring book, Curious Little Things, which I happen to have right here. How handy. You can paint and color along with me. I'll have a link for you guys down in the description. I selected an image from Curious Little Things that I thought would really suit the paints. Lots of bright colors, really saturated. I also felt like they had some decent skin tone selections in this set, so I thought this would be a knockout of the park for Mijello. As you guys saw, I was kind of conflicted. It did have some decent skin tones, but I had a lot of difficulty getting them as dark as I wanted them. And no, you know, not everybody is the same skin color, and there are going to be some people with a lighter skin tone than others, but I really struggled with developing the shading and the contrast and being able to build up the contrast I needed to develop form with both the skin tones that I mixed as well as the shadow color I mixed to highlight the skin, or underscore, that might be a better term, underscore the skin tone. With the flowers, although it looks very bright and saturated and full of color, I was really belaboring the paints to get them to do this. Usually with a professional grade watercolor paint, you can, if you want to work at masstone, really deliver saturation. You guys can see from my work that I like to go saturated with my watercolors. They're not all pastel. They're rarely pastel. So when I shared some work in progress photos of this, people were really impressed by how saturated they were. I just want to let you guys know, I had to fight with these watercolors to get them this saturated. I feel like Mijello tubes perform a lot better with immediate color delivery, and most of the professional grade brands that I have reviewed here on the channel are able to do this. In fact, these felt more like a student grade watercolor. They felt more like Melian pigments than they really felt like a professional grade watercolor, with how much they globbed up on the brush, how much paint waste there was, how they handled, how very easily they lifted and reactivated even when I didn't want them to, even working on a cotton rag paper. I just felt like these didn't really live up to the price tag, and they didn't really live up to the Mission Gold name. So I am honestly a little bit disappointed in them. I handled them the same way I handle watercolors for pretty much any illustration that I do. I did the same techniques, and I felt like I had to work a little bit harder with these to get what I wanted. In fact, me fighting with these paints made me really disappointed with this illustration when I first painted it. It is sometimes hard for me to separate how I feel about a piece from how much I had to fight the materials, which is why it's so important for me to do reviews for you guys, because I don't want you guys to feel that way about your art. So I set it aside for a week, and I've kind of come back to it with fresh eyes, and I think it's really cute, and I really like it, and I've kind of gotten over some of those negative feelings, but I still feel like I have used and reviewed better sets. If you're looking for a really big punch of color, quick impact, the Core Mini Palette is still my favorite for that. Those are some high chromo watercolors. These are okay. There's some granulation to them. I could do some color mixing, although I felt like my mixes were a little bit weaker than what I wanted. I could do some glazing, but sometimes it would reactivate the color underneath, so not necessarily successful glazing, even with thin applications. And I just felt kind of underwhelmed by this palette. I was kind of disappointed in this palette. So it is hard for me to recommend this as a professional grade palette. If you were given this palette, if you see this palette on sale, if it comes up on Black Friday or Prime Day, it's not a bad palette at a lower price point, but I don't really feel like it performs up to the Mijello standard. And I also don't feel like it performs any better than any of the other professional grade half pans I have tried or that I've reviewed for you guys. And I think there are some palettes that, if you're willing to spend a little bit more money, will last you a lot longer, because I noticed these started getting used up very quickly. And it's easier to get those colors in the US, like with Core, and they're going to deliver more color impact, which means you don't have to use as much paint to get what you're looking for. So I would recommend Da Vinci and Core over this particular palette. I really like the Da Vinci mixing set, and I have some more Da Vinci reviews coming up as part of my Easily Influenced series. So if you're curious about that, please keep an eye out for that. And I just really like Core. I use Core watercolors as like my go-to travel palette a lot. It's a very compact palette. Those paints last a crazy long time, and it is easier to find the refills, albeit the refills, and by refills I mean tubes. They're more expensive than some brands, but I find Core lasts a really long time for the way that I paint, which is setting them up in half pans to dry and then doing illustrations and comic pages at about this size. I am going to keep this set. I am going to try to continue to use this set. It isn't so bad that I wouldn't use it. I just think there are better professional grade palettes, especially if you like to do watercolor illustrations in the same vein that I do. You paint animals, you paint people, you paint plants. This set, while the color gamut is a decent one, for all of those things, the color impact, especially for skin tones and the ability to layer up and develop skin tones, is just kind of underwhelming. And I just wasn't really impressed. And I know there are other artists who really like this palette and have a different viewpoint than I do. So if my review didn't hit the notes you were looking for, if you do a different kind of art, if you have a different kind of art style, if you're looking for something else in your watercolor, go ahead and please check out those reviews. They may be able to offer some sort of insight or advice that I wasn't able to offer, just as I cater to a different demographic than they do, and I may be able to help out some of you who do illustration and do comic work, and you would be looking for a good watercolor set that would work well for that. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Make sure you check the description below for the show notes. I'll also include some additional links and information that I didn't cover in this review. If you would like to paint along with me, you can either purchase my coloring book, Curious Little Things. There is a link at the front of the book where you can actually download the high-res scans and print them out and paint along. Or you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/nettasoup. I will share the line art for this. And I have, Patreon has introduced collections. Finally, I do not know why it took them so long. Their system is so impossible to search. Even as both a creator and someone who supports a lot of other artists, I find it really frustrating. I'm so glad they offered collections, because now I can organize my information to make it even better, even more enticing to be a patron of what I do and support the work that I do, which, by the way, I use funds from Patreon to buy watercolor palettes like this one. So your support on Patreon goes right back into these reviews and into the channel. But there are collections now, and I have 3 collections. I may introduce more, kind of depending on what you guys want to see and what I think we need. I have my line art collection where it has all the printable line arts for as long as I could go back. It didn't allow me to go all the way back to the beginning of my Patreon. Maybe that's a good thing. But there's a bunch, there's a archive of printable line arts. And if you join my Patreon, you have access to those line arts. Please do not redistribute them. They are for personal use, and please do not resell them. Thank you. I also have a collection of my classes that I teach in person. So my presentations, my handouts, my printables, additional notes and resources for all of that, including the resources for making comics and zines, which I am super excited about because there was a lot of really great stuff that I created for those classes. And now I can share it easily on Patreon. Now, even if you join today, you can find all that. And that's what I'm super excited about, is having a usable working archive. And I have my papercraft activity playlist collection that I'm still working on tweaking, because the way collections work, you can only add posts. So it's not like I can upload all of the images into that collection. So you have to kind of go through the posts to find everything. I have most of the paper crafts that I have done up there, but there's some I'm having trouble finding, so I may have to re-upload them. It's still well worth checking out. I've just done a lot of paper crafts, and I know I have more than what I'm able to search and find. So I am really excited that they introduced collections, because it makes it so much more worthwhile to be a patron, because you can really see how much work I have shared and created over the years, and you can benefit from it even if you join today. So I'm really excited about that. Just $2 a month will get you access to all of that at patreon.com/nattosoup. And I will continue adding resources and line arts and printables as I continue to make them, because now I can organize them. That's so awesome. I used to have to put them all in a Google Doc and link them all, and it would take forever. So I'm really excited about that. So I hope you guys will check them out. So I hope today's review was helpful, useful, and informative. In the end, I still really enjoyed painting this illustration. It was more of a struggle than I would have liked, and more of a struggle than I'm used to with either my daily driver palette or with just some of the palettes that I talked about with you guys. I do think the price is a little high for the quality based on what I saw doing the field test and the swatches, and based on my prior experience with Mijello watercolors, but I also ordered it on Amazon, and Amazon tends to be high. You may find a different price if you find this palette in person. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I hope this was helpful, useful, and informative. And I look forward to seeing you guys again really soon. And make sure that happens. Make sure you click the subscribe button and hit the bell notification to let YouTube know that you want to see more from me. If you enjoyed today's review, make sure you click the like button. And if you would like to help me continue to make the things that I make and to grow the channel, it would really mean the world to me if you would share this link with a person or with a group, whether it is Reddit, Wet Canvas, Facebook, Blue Sky, Tumblr, Pinterest. If you would share this and help other people find this review. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon with another art supply review, tutorial, or art vlog. Bye guys!